Like what you said, I am Dr. Mupangavanhu from the law faculty, and I'm in the private law department. So the title of my presentation is Blended Teaching in Advanced Law of Contract. And basically, I'm going to do it in 3 parts. I'm going to deal with what I've done, and then look at what went wrong, and then the way forward. So I'll start by giving you a brief history about the course. So this is a course which we offer as an elective, and we offer it at 4th year level. So because students are introduced to the general principles of the law of contract at 3rd year level, at 4th year then we try to go into depth, and therefore students are introduced to complex legal articles as well as case law, and they have to read and comprehend those lengthy articles. So you can see there, because you are dealing with something that is lengthy, something that is going to be cumbersome and taking time, then students can easily get bored, and therefore I thought that was important for me to then incorporate blended teaching in my, and combine it with the other traditional approaches to teaching. So I make use of PowerPoint like everyone else, and then I also introduced podcasts. And the reason for podcasts was because after I teach a particular part of the work, then I recap by giving them a true or false persons. And the idea there is to kind of determine if the students are grasping the concepts and if they are following. So usually then it takes maybe 5 to 10 minutes of just doing that, because they must answer the true or false, and then they must exchange their books, and then someone else must mark your work, and then we discuss the answers. So that was taking my time, and I thought instead of me wasting time where I'm supposed to be lecturing, let me then make use of tests and quizzes. And then podcasts where I thought that it was going to be difficult to cover everything in class, then I'll do a podcast, and then I supplement that with videos as well, but I haven't been able to put them online as yet. Like there was also a time when I wasn't on campus this term, and because I wasn't available on campus, then I was also able to create a folder on eCanva, and then they written a test. I had the marks, and they received their scripts, but I couldn't do revision with them there and then. So I would then create that folder where I then uploaded the test paper as well as the answers which I was expecting from them, and that helped then in ensuring that they would then get feedback, and then ensuring that they would also know what was expected of them in terms of the test. So in terms of what went wrong, I'm basically going to share my lessons, share my experience in terms of what went wrong. So in terms of the podcast, I couldn't use my own PC because the sound system there wasn't working. So I had to use a colleague's PC, and then when I was doing the podcast, there were some pictures, which is like, I think I was left with some 2 slides to just cover in terms of my podcast, which means I was almost done with the podcast. And then suddenly there were some photos which just came on the screen, and I panicked. So instead of pausing, then I stopped. And I phoned Caroline, I explained the story, but basically I lost that podcast. I had to redo the podcast. So that was like difficult for me. That experience itself was difficult and painful to just then have to redo everything because I stopped. The other thing was that my podcasts were too long. So instead of having maybe a 5-minute podcast, my podcast was almost as long as 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And then after I was done with the podcast, and when I was trying to listen to the podcast, my own voice was boring. So I got to a point where I would just stop it, and I would think, I'm just going to upload this podcast because they were just too long. And then the other challenge which I faced was the fact that after I've uploaded the podcast, and I tell students to then listen to the podcast before they come to class, so that at least then when we go to class, we are engaging with the subject matter. Then most of them, they were not listening to the podcast on time. So when they come to class, it's as good as you are starting to teach again, and you have to cover the same content which in this case you were not supposed to be covering, and you're supposed to be engaging with the course. So in terms of the lessons learned, like I said that I made use of the quizzes and tests to save time. I also learned that if there is no mark allocated to the assessment, then you're going to only have half of the class doing the work. So that was a challenge because then I didn't have any marks for that because already I've got other ways in which I assess students, like I use oral presentations. Because it's 4th year level, I'm trying to develop certain skills in the course. So the orals are there to ensure that they are able to then articulate themselves if they have to present to someone else. So they do that in class, and their peers have to ask them questions. And then I've got tests as well. So I didn't think that was important for me to then allocate marks. So that actually backfired because then most of them, half of the class, didn't do the task. But for those who completed the task, then their performance was good. And the good thing was that then with those true or false, if you get the answer wrong, then you get immediate feedback there to say what went wrong, what is it that you're supposed to consider in this case. And then I would also refer them to case law. So they would also then go to the important cases in the course, and I think that also helped in that regard. So what are the lessons that I've learned? I think in the future then I'm going to allocate marks to my assessments, even if it's going to be 2%, but there has to be a mark. Because if there are no marks, then they're not motivated as students to actually do those assessments. And I think that when it comes to the issue of the podcast, then it's actually a necessity that you don't make them too long. In the same way that I could listen to them and my voice was boring, I think it would be the same thing even for the students as well, that if it's too long, then it's just monotonous, and then they won't want to actually listen to that podcast. So in the future, I'm going to ensure that the podcasts are short and that I also upload them timelessly so that at least then I'm hoping that in this case when they come to class, then they would have listened to those podcasts. And then in terms of trying to then figure out, are podcasts there to supplement, to replace a lecture, or they're there to supplement a lecture? I think my view there is that podcasts are supposed to supplement a lecture and not replace a lecture, simply because of the fact that even though there are advantages, for example, the fact that the student can listen to the podcast in his or her own time, and that they can go backwards and replay a certain part, I still think that if they replace a lecture and not all of them listen, then it's going to be difficult as well to ensure that you have covered whatever you need to cover. And if that affects the understanding of the other topics in the course, that can also have a negative effect. So I might not necessarily be a technocrat insofar as emerging technology is concerned, but I think I agree with Robin Scott where he says that no matter how many mistakes you make or how slow you progress, you are still way ahead of everyone who isn't trying. So I'm just trying my best, and hopefully in the future then the students are going to also benefit, or they're going to see the benefit of actually the emerging technologies which we are introducing in our courses. Thank you.
Thank you, Yeukai. Any comments for Yeukai? And that statement is so powerful. The rector also said the other day that sometimes you get people that comment and critique after they've done nothing. Just always, they're there, but they're not there in spite of the action. Always just chirping. You need to ask them, what have they done on the journey? So, thank you very much.